Hello, I'm Kevin Kosar, and today I'm chatting with Josh Noel. He's the author of three books, the most recent of which is Malört, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit, which was just published by Chicago Review Press, and it's dynamite. Josh, thanks for taking the time to join me.
Thank you, Kevin. Glad to be with you.
So I myself have tasted Malört. Uh, I know what it is, but for viewers who are unfamiliar with it, what is this stuff and how is it made?
So it is legendary stuff. It is polarizing stuff. Uh, it is stuff that people love to talk about and obsess over and love and hate. But it's actually something very simple. So it's a spirit, and it's a pretty made via a simple process. It's basically neutral spirit, so vodka essentially, that is aged on wormwood, which is a bitter herb. And then it gets just a little bit of sugar to round it out right at the final step. So there's not a lot of steps to the process, but the result is something pretty striking and bitter due to that wormwood and astringent and pretty much one of a kind in American bars and liquor stores. There are things sort of similar, but nothing quite like it.
Yeah, I mean, some people have probably tasted absinthe or absenta, which also have that wormwood in it. And I've tasted those things. Those things just, they've got more of a black licorice sort of taste.
Mhm.
If you don't like black licorice, you're probably not going to like absinthe or absenta. But Malort is different. How does it taste?
Uh, Bitter and astringent, and people love to. There's a line in the book about how Malort makes poets of regular people, um, and that's people. It's pretty shocking to a lot of palates the first time you try it because of the bitterness and the astringency. That said, these days people seem less shocked by it than maybe they were a generation ago when those flavors were really jarring to us. But now a bitterness makes a little more sense to us through we eat kale and Brussels sprouts and we drink India Pale Ale. So I mean, bitterness is more excuse me, a part of our sort of culinary roadmap than it was 20 years ago, which is when Malort was really jarring to people. But now it's still shocking, but a little less so. And that's due to the bitterness, the astringency. People love to say things like, "Oh, it tastes like battery acid mixed with grapefruit mixed with sadness," things like that. It's just it's got, I always say it has a really strong point of view compared to a lot of things we eat and drink. And it's pretty singular in its bitterness and astringency. Even as our palates have grown more complex and the things we eat more complex, Malort still stands out.
Yeah, your book made me laugh frequently. Often when it was when people trying to describe their reactions to tasting this, and some of it was just, here's what it's like on my palate. So there was the one fella who said like, it tastes like you poured cheap vodka into a utility drawer. The place where you have rubber
Yeah.
bands, pennies, and batteries laying around. But then there was like the kind of cognitive response to it. And you noted that in the book, one of the fans of Malort kind of started this thing at a bar where people would take a shot, then write down their responses to it. And if you quote some of the responses, which I got to read because it's just so funny. Malort, tonight's the night you fight your dad. Another one is drink Malort. It's easier than telling people you have nothing to live for.
Hmm.
And Malort, remind yourself why you stopped drinking. It's just unbelievable how intense people respond to this stuff. So this is an oddball booze. For some people, it induces a gag reflex. Yeah, you found it worthy of a book. Why?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I wrote for the Chicago Tribune for a long time, and I wrote about Malort there. And so just through that, I knew people were interested in it. People are fascinated by this stuff. whenever I wrote about Malört for the Tribune, those stories were read and those stories were shared. So I knew people were interested in it. I had one of those sort of quintessential light bulb moments. I enjoy Malört, and especially after a large meal, take a shot to settle the stomach. And so I was doing that one night at home. I keep a bottle at home, and I took the shot, and I had the light bulb flash above my head. Huh, I know people are interested in this stuff. We don't know a lot about it. And what we do know really only invites more questions. The central question, of course, was how did so Malort dates back to the 20s or 30s in Chicago and languished as an afterthought for most of its existence. What I knew and what everyone knew was that sometime around 2010 or so, Malort somehow got really popular. A new generation of drinkers discovered it, and it just took off like a rocket ship. But how did that happen? That was sort of the central question. So, and then there were some other things that in the narrative that were very loosely known that really just invited more exploration. So it was just a moment of realizing people are fascinated by the stuff. People love the stuff. People hate the stuff. People love to hate the stuff. There's just a lot of passion and energy around it. And we don't know much, and what we know just begs more questions. So let me see if there's a book here. I wasn't sure there was. It took a couple months of reporting, but after a couple months, I knew there was a great story, and it only got more interesting as I went on. Really rich characters, fascinating relationships, love, heartbreak. Someone goes to jail. There's a 30-year marital affair. Well, it's only a marital affair for about 10 years. But, complicated relationships, complicated characters. And you wouldn't necessarily expect that from a book about a brand of liquor, but it was there. So I just dove in.
Yeah, yeah, and much as I would love to talk to you about some of those characters and some of those kind of plot twists, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to ruin it for readers who I really think should pick up a copy of this book because it's just a remarkable story. So I just want to double back to you mentioned that 2010 or so, all of a sudden people start getting interested in this stuff, and you quote the sales figures and shows that Malort sales start going up, 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 up. I mean, this was a brand that was almost dead. Yet they didn't change the formula. They didn't make it an easier, more attractive drink. Why? What do people see in this beverage? Why is it not the case that people just try it once and say, God, never again, and the sales just tank?
Yeah, it really comes down to, and this is so a book needs to have a front story, which in the front story is Malort, but then it also needs a backstory, which is sort of the broader story you're telling. And that's the answer to your question, which is there was a cultural shift. We ate and drank a certain way through the 80s and 90s. Not the boldest and bravest flavors, let's say. No one ate kale in the 90s. You just didn't. It was the decoration on the salad bar. By the 2000s, we were eating things like kale and Brussels sprouts and shopping at farmers markets and farm to table restaurants, and words like local and craft became really important. Um, the craft cocktail movement happened. There was a cocktail revolution. Bars became more interesting in what they were serving. There was just a massive shift in how we ate and drank. Um, and Malort, I would say it capitalized on it, but it did nothing. Malort stayed the same. People just, this new generation of eaters and drinkers discovered it. And it had two really important things going for it. Well, at least one was that it was very local to Chicago. It was sold only in Chicago. Now it's sold in 30 plus states, including your homeland of the DC area. A couple of really great Malort bars there, actually. Um, Malort was local at a time that local was really important, and Malort was it had authenticity, which is something that it's hard to put your finger on what makes something authentic, right? But for a product that a company is trying to sell, it's really important. And Malort was authentic not because it was trying to be, but because it had just been around forever. And the label hadn't been changed. The bottle was kind of cheap, and it was the same bottle they basically always used. And it was just this intensely local, authentic product with a really, again, strong point of view. It was very bitter at a time we were starting to understand bitter. And then there's one other little wrinkle that I thought was really interesting was social media. This new generation had the ability to talk about this thing that they were discovering in these old Chicago dive bars and share it, share the experience with this device in our pockets, right? And this whole idea of quote Malört face took off in about 2000, as early as 2007, on the Flickr website, an early picture sharing app, precursor to Instagram, basically. And so people were discovering the stuff, and then they were able to talk about it and share the experience. And I'm actually a pretty firm believer that without social media, if that didn't exist, I'm not sure Malort would have ever had its renaissance. But so it was sort of this stew of all these cultural changes intersecting with the fact that Malort had always been there, and suddenly it became cool after literal generations of not being of being the opposite of cool.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was one of those bottles that kind of sat at the bottom of the back of the bar thing, along with dusty stuff that's used to make, grasshopper cocktails and amongst all the creme de menthe and that sort of stuff. Like it was just there hanging around for the longest time. And you look at that, I looked at that bottle, and I'm somebody who spent a number of years in the Williamsburg area of New York City in the mid and late 90s. And the word kitsch just popped into my head. I was like, oh my God, if this stuff was brought to Williamsburg back in those days, people would have gone nuts for it
Yeah.
because it is that kind of old, cheap, earlier era. There's no effort by the people who are producing it to make it cool for the time. It's just this thing from another day, and it's weird. And so put that together, it just kind of becomes a fun thing to experiment with and to kind of grab onto.
Yeah, and you sort of nod to a subtle point, which is so the brand, by the time it began to find its new audience, was owned by a woman named Pat Gablick, who operated the brand out of her apartment. It was literally a one-person company. She operated the company from her spare bedroom. She invested no marketing, no sales, no communications, nothing. She changed nothing. And the fact that it was old and kitschy, which I think is a very fair description at that time. If she had been trying to sell it and make it cool, that would have made it less cool. The fact was, it was this relic of another era, and that's what helped it appeal to this new generation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I won't quote the ads that her predecessor, uh, George Brody, ginned up in the 1950s, which are absolutely hilarious. I'll leave them for readers to see when they get your book. But I can only imagine what it was like to stumble across that stuff. I should say, if you saw the inside of my review copy, you'd notice a lot of marginalia. I was so engaged in reading this thing, and a lot of little smiley faces to indicate lines where you just made me laugh out loud, places where I put exclamation points or OMGs where I was just shocked or something struck me as outrageous. So it was really a fun book to read. Was it as much fun to write?
Oh yeah, and it's great to hear your reaction to it as a reader. That's you never know how someone's going to respond to some of that stuff, but I'm glad to know a lot of it landed. Yeah, it's a wild story, and the fact that it was such a wild story and the characters so rich. I mean, that's my favorite part is really just the characters and their relationships and the way the story sort of twists and turns. It was fun to write because I that stuff surprised me as the reporter and the writer. I kept being surprised by the story, and that's the best kind of narrative. I mean, that's what you want, right? If it's just straight line, it's going to be a harder one to pull off in terms of engaging a reader or even yourself. So yeah, it was really fascinating to sort of peel back the layers. And there was a lot of layer peeling and triangulating and trying to make sense of things. Well, why did this person leave the company? And why were they heartbroken when they did, and why did this person love Malort so much? I mean, it's just, gets to emotional layers you wouldn't expect, but everyone was really eager to tell their story pretty much, um, even when the story wasn't always a happy one. But it's just it was just a, took on such cultural importance and personal importance to people. This weird brand of liquor. I mean, it's amazing the lenses through which we find meaning sometime, and this is one of the stranger ones.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Josh, I know you're busy with the book tour, and I promised when I pitched you on doing this chat that I'd keep our time brief. So first, let me thank you for writing this book, which again I really, really enjoyed, and I hope many people will buy it and get as much of a kick out of it as I did. And I sure hope that your book tour doesn't require you to do too many shots of Malort.
Well, as stated, I enjoy Malort, so it's labor of love for me. But thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the time and the kind words. I'm really glad you enjoyed the book, and yeah, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you.